Well, thank you very much for this very kind invitation, and it's very intimidating to be sharing a stage with such luminaries, and to that extent I'm actually glad I'm going first, so that otherwise by contrast they'd be like, you've got these senior people and then you've got somebody who doesn't know that much. So I'm going to talk about, I like the title of the talk of this event. It's obviously something of very great interest. I'm going to approach it in a slightly different way though. So I do believe that universities are or should be a bastion of dissent. It's also clear that there's been obviously a clampdown within universities across the country, severe restrictions on academic freedom in many different ways. Professor Purvanand has written a lot about this, and you'll find this documented quite extensively by the Indian Academic Freedom Network, amongst other groups. And even if there's no crackdown, there's obviously a lot of self-censorship everywhere. Many years ago, I used to keep a blog which I called the Calendar of Cancelled Events. But then after a while I thought there's no point, because there are many events that are not cancelled but they're just never held, because that it's not worth the effort to go through. But that's not what I want to talk about today, for a couple of reasons which I'll sketch, and then I'll go to the positive part of what I want to say. One is, these facts are now well known, and I'm assuming that an audience in JNU of the kind that's come here don't need to be persuaded about the importance of academic freedom. So in a way I don't have more to contribute beyond pointing you to the many people who have done important work on this. Another reason to move the conversation away from both dissent and academic freedom, for me at least, is that when you talk about academic freedom, it ends up being a bit dispiriting and a bit disempowering today. The state, after all, is very strong, and the sorts of guardians of academic freedom outside the ambit of the educational institutions, they're quite unpredictable. Consider that the new Chief Justice of India authored a very strange order after the FIR against Professor Ali Khan Mahmoodabad earlier this year. You'll recall there was this controversy at Ashoka University, and amongst the things that was said was, look, he's not allowed to speak on the issue for which he was charged, and nobody was allowed to speak or protest on that issue. It was very, and this is the case, by the way, when it's clear that he had broken no law. The FIR should just have been squashed, and it wasn't. So we are in a space where external guarantors of academic freedom can't really be relied upon anymore. So I want to move away to another set of conversations about the role of universities in a democracy, outside of the role of dissent. And some of what I will say, I think, will sound utopian, be that as it may. I do think it opens up a field of academic agency which is within our grasp, even when one doesn't have state power behind us. And I think it draws upon a conception of academic life advanced by figures like Max Weber. During the introduction there was a thought that our university is the site for mere professional training. And part of what I'm going to suggest is universities as a site for professional training can be quite important and distinctive in the life of a democracy. And so I want to sketch some of those ways, and maybe end with the one thing I'd be happy if you took away would be to question the mere in the mere professional training. Now, of course, there are many ways in which a university can be important to the life of a democracy. So I'm going to set aside, for instance, the ways that political activity within the governance of a university is is very important. Student protests on fees or the condition of hostels or what you eat. I mean, these are very important. I teach at IIT Delhi, and I frequently have the thought that I just finished teaching a course on democracy at IIT Delhi, which has formal democratic institutions in terms of student politics. It doesn't have student unions, but it certainly lacks a kind of democratic culture. And I think of the students there as being so disempowered compared to students at a place like JNU, and willing to put up with much worse in terms of their conditions than I think other public universities would put up. So that's again clearly a space where democracy makes a difference. But I want to set that aside as well. And what I want to, in these remarks, just talk about a couple of ways in which the core aspects of academic life, I'm thinking the creation of new knowledge, the preservation of old knowledge, and the teaching of students, passing on this knowledge, might contribute specifically to democratic life. And again, my apologies, but I'm going to use sort of old-fashioned and somewhat utopian language, which might be very far away from the lived realities of students, teachers in this very embattled times that we live in. And well, the first is, you can think of one of the roles a university might have is a space for some kind of civilized disagreement. From the outside, the JNU campus sometimes seems to be quite a polarized kind of environment. It's always fun to come and look at the range of posters on these walls, and obviously there's a lot of disagreement expressed there. But I think that you're fortunate that as a result there is a wide spectrum of disagreement available for you to sample from. And again, when I compare this to the situation at a place like IIT Delhi, which is really just across the road, it's a dramatic difference. And one question that I've had for friends who've taught at JNU or studied at JNU is, to what extent are people's minds changed by the range of opinions to which you are exposed? And if the answer is, to some extent, that's a great thing. So if it's possible in the kind of university environment to agree to disagree with your peers, then that's a very good thing. And it's an important aspect of democratic life. Now, sometimes it might be just not possible. Maybe it's impossible to have a relationship of equal respect to somebody who regards where you're coming from or your core ethical outlook on life with a kind of contempt. Maybe that's just not possible. It's possible sometimes that there are disagreements in a university space where you can't rely on good faith of other parties. That's also part of our reality. So whether it's possible or not to have a space of civilized disagreement, I would leave it as a kind of open question. But to the extent that it's not possible, even within a relatively homogeneous space such as JNU, I mean, when one thinks of JNU, one thinks of diversity. But if you think of India as a whole, I would guess that even the student population in JNU is a somewhat homogeneous subset of the diversity of the country as a whole. So it would be very bad news for democracy in general if this mode of relating to one another is not available in a university like this. So that's the first point. A university's role in democratic life via its ability to allow people to disagree in, I wouldn't say productive ways, maybe they're not productive, but to be able to disagree, let's say, without a resort to violence, or maybe to be able to disagree in a way that allows people to change each other's minds. And the second, which is I think more important for what I want to say, is that the academic vocation, in theory at least, allows for certain new forms of solidarity. And so perhaps there are deep divides on social and political issues. Again, you might think, which is as it should be in a democracy. Are there nonetheless shared norms and standards for academic inquiry, concern for evidence, a love of learning new things? This is what I had in mind by professional training as an academic. Are there norms that are universal across different disciplines, the sciences, the social sciences, the humanities? If not, are there things that one can do to generate agreement on these norms, generate excitements about values that are specific to the academic enterprise, might not be appropriate in other sorts of institutions? Dr. Ambedkar has this very famous line. All of you have heard this phrase, I'm sure, constitutional morality. It's a phrase that I think is often misinterpreted by people who use it, no less the Supreme Court. But I'm just going to quote one part of it. And it says, "It involves a perfect confidence in the bosom of every citizen amidst the bitterness of party contest that the forms of the Constitution will not be less sacred in the eyes of his opponents than in his own." And what I understand this to mean is that in a democracy, one must fulfill two distinct roles. There's the partisan political one, in which it's a space of antagonism. We want to persuade one another, capture their beliefs, marginalize them, if at least electorally, if we don't share their beliefs. So that's one role. That's to go back to the quote, the bitterness of party contest. Perfectly legitimate in a democracy to have bitter disagreements. But then there's also the role of which you occupy at the same time, being a citizen in a democratic republic, which involves, in some respect, a respect for one's co-citizens and a recognition that they have an equal claim on political power. And these are not trivial things. Again, I've been talking in this class on democracy, I've been teaching at IIT. People talk about having a very minimalist conception of democracy, which is one where you respect the results of elections and you have peaceful transfers of power. This ability to recognize oneself as a citizen, accept the results of elections that go against one, that's not a trivial, if you look globally or if you look historically, it may not be much of an achievement, but it is a serious achievement. And I would think, or I guess I do think of the university as a space in which one might become accustomed to a dual role of this kind. So, we have roles as teachers, students, researchers, to step out of our political selves, our partisan selves, I would say, I'll come back to that, which again doesn't mean abandoning one's political self in any way. But it might be that, within that academic space, there's a chance to develop new kinds of relationships, new kinds of solidarities, which seem extremely valuable. You all may have had a kind of experience in any WhatsApp group that you're part of that comes, where it's not a self-selecting group, a school alumni group or a resident welfare association or a faculty group, where there's some comment made on some political issue and it sort of blows up and people leave the group, or people delete messages and then say, no, we don't want politics on this group, let's keep it only for things that matter to residents. Or and I used to think that's a kind of evasion. Surely one should be able to discuss what one wants on these kinds of groups. But I'm now seeing maybe there is some value again to having being able to relate to people in maybe quite thick kinds of ways that that are separate from one's partisan political components. And I think that's part of the Weberian ideal. I have in mind this essay from over 100 years ago called Science as a Vocation. There are many spaces like that where such solidarities are possible. But I think universities are an important such space, partly because, again, they're not self-selecting on partisan grounds. People might come from many different kinds of backgrounds with different kinds of beliefs and are thrown together. Now, this kind of Weberian ideal, you might well criticize by saying, look, it's a kind of depoliticization of the academic space, and one often hears the slogan, look, everything is political. That's I think there's some truth in some interpretation of the term political. And what I'd suggest is that such forms of solidarity as academics, whether students together with other students, or researchers with other researchers, or students and researchers, I don't think these forms of solidarity are apolitical by any means. I think they allow the changes, they lead to changes in the structures of power around us, and that's one sense in which this is a political kind of enterprise. And I think in the end, in fact, they might be the best way to shore up academic freedom as well, in a context where, again, external gatekeepers are unreliable. To be able to generate kind of cross-partisan understandings that academic life requires certain kinds of protections, not just protections, but also support from the state and the rest of society. I think that's an important political project. But as a political project, it requires this kind of distancing from one's more particular political roles. And I've thought, and Professor Purvanand has written a lot, for instance, about the kinds of attacks on academic integrity when it comes to hiring at places like JNU or Delhi University. And I've been wondering, what could one do to prevent something like that from happening? And again, one role is the courts or the formal structures of power. But again, in a kind of utopian sense, I would think it would be nice to build towards a space where you have a kind of social confidence that there's some norms that academics, because of their sense of vocation, would not violate. They'll be embarrassed to violate because they think of themselves as part of a fraternity which is committed to certain kinds of impersonal norms. And where you could imagine a situation where, I may have very strong disagreements both about the academic content of another person's work, and maybe, again, I may have very strong disagreements with their first-order political beliefs, but nevertheless, see it as important to preserve certain kinds of norms of transparency or academic excellence understood in some way or the other. And I imagine this would be true in other professions. Doctors, I would think that there are norms that doctors share about, the importance of antiseptic environments for operations to take place in. You think, look, that's an important norm. It saved many, many, many thousands of lives over the years, and it's a norm that you could imagine, doctors agreeing with, even if they disagree about everything else. When you can imagine cases where, look, I could be really, I might have some first-order disagreement with somebody, but agree with them completely. Look, we need to keep those disagreements out of this professional enterprise of being a doctor. And to my mind, it would be an empowering step to be able to build and secure agreement on those kinds of norms. Again, the utopian part of this is I have no idea how to do that, but oh wow. And the last point I'll make is that developing professional expertise, being seen to have this kind of expertise in the broader social context, I think that's a form of capital with respect to the political class as a whole. So again, this is another way in which I think the appeal to professionalism, professionalization has a political payoff. There was this Václav Havel, name that will be familiar to many of you. He's a Czech dissident, became the president, had a book called The Power of the Powerless. And one of the things he says in that book is that, in conditions of tyranny, in conditions of oppression, in fact, an appeal to professional values is the first step that you might take to a certain kind of freedom. And that's maybe an additional way in which being a member of a university and seeing oneself as having a particular academic role could be maybe essential to the practice of democracy. But with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.